The founding of New England is part of the founding myth of the United States. The stories of the Pilgrims, the Mayflower, and Plymouth Rock are recounted every November at Thanksgiving. But there is a darker side to New England, which is also important to its founding and culture. Gloomy Puritans, witch hunts, and hangings. A kind of dark academia meets colonial America. Authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Arthur Miller colored the region as a guilt-haunted society that repressed the individual for the sake of the collective. But was this inevitable? Was New England always destined to become a land of Puritanism and conformity? Maybe not. Things might have been very different. Maybe even a bit more jolly. Only 4 years after the Pilgrims landed in America, and only 40 miles away from Plymouth Rock, a completely opposite society would take root. This rival settlement would feature drunken parties, a giant maypole, cooperation with Native Americans, and religious toleration. This was Merrymount, the anti-Plymouth, the party colony.
When it's time to party, we will party hard.
In June 1624, an English ship, the Unity, sailed into what is today Boston Harbor. Her captain was Richard Wollaston, a former pirate. The passengers were 30 indentured servants, as well as a handful of gentlemen. One of these gentlemen was Thomas Morton, a 45-year-old lawyer. Though he had married into wealth and built a successful legal practice, Morton abandoned his old life to go to the New World, possibly because of conflicts with his wife and Puritan stepson. Morton had been to New England once before in 1622, and he was captivated by the beauty of the land, though he did complain about the stern attitude of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. 2 years later, he was back and intent on making it in the New World. Captain Wollaston's plan was to establish a trading post, close enough to the Native Americans to trade for furs, but far enough from Plymouth to avoid bothering the Pilgrims. This venture succeeded, and soon Mount Wollaston, as it was originally called, was a thriving trade center. In 1626, Wollaston took some of the indentured servants to Jamestown to hire them out to the Virginia tobacco plantations. He would die of disease in the same year, leaving his lieutenant, a man named Fitcher, in charge. This was when Thomas Morton made his move. Morton threw a party for the remaining indentured servants. Then, after everyone had plenty of alcohol, the lawyer presented his case. He advised the men to overthrow Fitcher and free themselves from their servitude. Morton then said he would take them on as partners, and they all would converse, trade, plant, and live together as equals, and support and protect one another. Morton and his followers then kicked Fitcher out of the colony. Once the bloodless coup was complete, the party could begin. The colony was rechristened Mount Marie, after the French word for sea, but everybody called it Merrymount, because why not? No treaties were made with the Native Americans since Morton saw them as equals. Merrymount didn't have a wall or palisade, as the settlers felt they had nothing to fear from their neighbors. The men of Merrymount freely traded and socialized with local Indians, and to use a 17th century term, consorted with native women. Morton did away with formal titles of master and servant. Everyone, be they English or indigenous, was now referred to as partner. Morton started calling himself Mine Host. But what was Mine Host Morton's plan for the colony? What bold, new direction would he take? This was an exciting new world of possibility.
Just what is it that you want to do?
Well, we want to be free to do what we want to do. We're going to have a good time. We're going to have a party.
But before we get to the party, it helps to more fully understand the situation in New England. For that, we must look back to Old England. In fact, we must go to church. Ever since King Henry VIII broke his kingdom away from the Roman Catholic Church way back in 1533, England had suffered from religious division and political turmoil. Successive rulers, from the sickly Protestant Edward VI to the childless Catholic Mary I to the Protestant Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, made their respective religions the national faith. Persecutions, uprisings, and political schemes would follow each monarch. However, by 1563, Protestantism had won the day, and the Church of England, or Anglican Church, was established as the faith of the realm.
Oh Lord, please don't burn us, don't kill or toast your flock.
Even with the end of established Catholicism in England, political and religious authorities found it almost impossible to wipe away nearly 1,000 years of medieval Catholic culture from the English people. Older Catholic customs, such as the celebration of feasts like Christmas and Pentecost, would continue. One notable custom, borrowed from pre-Christian Germanic pagans, was the maypole. A popular symbol of springtime and fertility, communities would erect wooden poles, deck them with ribbons and flowers, then dance and celebrate around them. By the late 1560s, the Church of England itself was divided. Basically, the split was between the mainstream Anglicans and radical Puritans. Mainstream Anglicans wanted to walk a middle way between Catholic practices and Protestant theology. Puritans wanted to purify the church, looking only to the Bible for religious teaching, seeing Catholic practices as superstition and church art as idolatry. As time went on, some Puritans gave up on the Church of England altogether, becoming separatists. To them, the church was unfixable and had become a tool of Satan. One separatist congregation from northern England left the country entirely, first for Holland, then for the New World. These were the famous Pilgrims. In September 1620, the Mayflower landed in modern-day Massachusetts. The 102 settlers established a colony at Plymouth. The colony struggled for survival in its first year, losing almost half its population. But under the capable leadership of William Bradford, Plymouth endured. A harvest feast was held sometime in the autumn of 1621. With native people of the Wampanoag tribe in attendance. Of course, it would have been very different from the modern American Thanksgiving.
Almost time for turkey sandwiches!
But while the Pilgrims didn't always wear black, as they are often portrayed in art, they gained a somber reputation for themselves. They believed in a strict theology of predestination, the idea that God chooses certain people to be saved in heaven and others to be damned in hell, and that the individual has no free will in the matter. Celebrations believed to be unbiblical, like Christmas, were forbidden in Plymouth, along with so-called worldly music, theater, and sports. The only day of rest was Sunday, which would be mostly spent in church. Sermons could last up to 3 hours. The community would sing psalms without musical accompaniment, as instruments were considered unbiblical. Now at Plymouth, the separatist Pilgrims had built their godly society. A new Israel in the new world. But neither William Bradford nor his Pilgrim community could have expected that they would have a very raucous and very radical next-door neighbor.
Hey. Yeah.
But getting back to the party. On May 1st, 1627, mine host Morton would oversee the celebration of Mayday, announcing that, with proclamation that the 1st of May at Merrymount shall be kept holy day. There would be plenty of food, beer, liquor, and dancing. Native Americans were invited to drink and celebrate as equals. It would be the first rager in the history of New England, and at the center of it all would be a good old-fashioned English maypole. Morton later described the scene. A goodly pine tree, of 80 foot long, was reared up, with a pair of buck's horns nailed, one somewhat near unto the top of it, where it stood as a fair sea mark, for directions how to find out the way to mine host of Merrymount. How many partiers found their way to Merrymount that Mayday is unknown, but there must have been a huge crowd. One source states that 10 pounds sterling worth of beer and strong water were consumed in one morning. As of November 2023, that's somewhere around $3,200 worth of alcohol. With trade profits flowing in and mine host Morton as popular as ever, Merrymount flourished. 1 year later in 1628, Mayday was celebrated again, with an even bigger party. The maypole standing tall, it was as if the party would never end. It was
Spring break. Spring break. Spring break forever.
Not surprisingly, the Merrymount colony was offensive to the neighboring Pilgrims of Plymouth. Pilgrim leader William Bradford would later write in his historical work of Plymouth Plantation that the Merrymount colonists fell to utter licentiousness and led a dissolute and profane life. Morton became lord of misrule and maintained, as it were, a school of atheism. Thomas Morton's religious opinions were different, to say the least. But his colony wasn't actually atheistic. Merrymount didn't have a state religion, but Morton was known to lead Christian services with the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, a text hated by the Pilgrims because of its traditional rituals. Morton happily blended Anglican Christianity, Germanic paganism, and Native American religion into his own belief system. But to the strict Pilgrims, the prayer book, maypole, and indigenous rituals were all heathen idols. Pilgrims were also disturbed by the Englishmen cohabitating with female Native Americans. Bradford complained that the settlers at Merrymount were inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together like so many fairies, or furies rather, and worse practices, as if they had anew revived and celebrated the feasts of the Roman goddess Flora or the beastly practices of the mad Bacchanalians. But most troubling of all, the Merrymount settlers openly traded firearms, gunpowder, and lead shot with the Indians in exchange for furs.
What are you buying?
In 1628, Bradford wrote a letter demanding that Merrymount stop selling weapons to the Indians. Morton, ever the lawyer, replied that he didn't have to stop because there was no law against it. You might say he employed a now famous legal argument.
Don't worry, there's nothing illegal about any of this.
Are you sure?
Of course, this is America.
I see.
It's a free country, don't you know that?
I didn't know it was that free.
Bradford would later claim that the conflict between Plymouth and Merrymount was triggered by this ongoing arms trade with the Native Americans. Morton makes no mention of this practice in his writings, stating that the Pilgrims were just out to get him for partying too hard. In June 1628, William Bradford called out the Plymouth militia to break up the party at Merrymount. Captain Miles Standish, nicknamed Captain Shrimp by Morton, was ordered to arrest Merrymount's Lord of Misrule. Bradford records that Morton defended himself stiffly, closed his doors, armed his associates, and had dishes of powder and bullets ready on the table. And if they had not been overarmed with drink, more harm might have been done. They summoned him to yield, but got nothing but scoffs from him. At length, fearing they would wreck the house, some of his crew came out, intending not to yield, but to shoot. But they were so drunk that their guns were too heavy for them. He himself, with a carbine, overcharged and almost half filled with powder and shot, tried to shoot Captain Standish, but he stepped up to him and put aside his gun and took him. Nobody was killed in this battle. The only injury was to a drunken Merrymount colonist who cut his nose against the point of a sword that someone was holding in his direction. Standish ordered the maypole to be chopped down. Then he had Morton bound and taken to Plymouth as a prisoner. A Pilgrim court ordered Morton to be deported back to England, but until a ship came in, he would be marooned on the barren Isle of Shoals. The Pilgrims gave him a change of clothes, a little food, and some wine, but it wasn't enough to survive on the rocky exposed island. Friendly Native Americans supplied Morton with food, and in September 1628, a fishing vessel arrived to take him back to England. A new governor also arrived that September, the Puritan John Endicott, who attempted to put the fear of God into the now leaderless Merrymount settlers. For Endicott's part in this story, Morton would nickname him Captain Littleworth. It seemed like the party was over. Or was it? Ever the lawyer, Morton was able to talk his way out of his legal problems back in England. By the spring of 1629, he had returned to the New World and was ready to start the party again. But unfortunately for him,
the world is changed.
The maypole was destroyed. The fields were overgrown with weeds. The settlers were scattered. Even his beloved Mount Mary had been renamed by the Pilgrims to Mount Dagon, after a demonic pagan god of the Old Testament. So Morton stayed around Plymouth for a while, where he worked as a secretary to Mayflower Compact signer Isaac Allerton, before lighting out for Merrymount once again. Trade and agriculture were resumed at the Merrymount settlement. Even Governor Endicott took notice, because he would arrive that autumn to steal corn to feed his own growing Puritan population. The governor seized the food, but found no weapons, as Morton had been tipped off to the coming threat. The handful of Merrymount settlers would survive the winter by hunting and trading with the Indians. There would be no more Maydays at Merrymount. Morton had to keep a low profile, as more Puritans were flooding into the newly established Massachusetts Bay colony. Still, on August 23, 1630, the first court to be held in Massachusetts Bay ordered the arrest of Thomas Morton. The charges included inciting an Indian revolt, cheating the natives out of trade goods, and stealing a canoe. Ever the lawyer, Morton argued that there were no credible witnesses against him. The Puritan court had no jurisdiction at Merrymount, and the canoe was just borrowed. The court was not convinced and ordered Morton to be deported to England again. His remaining property was confiscated. Before setting sail, Morton would be taken back to Merrymount as a prisoner and made to watch as Endicott's men burned down his house. It seemed like the party was finally over. Or was it? Back in England, and with nothing but time on his hands, Morton concocted a new plan. Ever the lawyer, he sued the Massachusetts Bay Company in an attempt to get their colonial charter revoked. Morton claimed the Puritans in New England were committing rebellion against the king by setting up their own independent church and court system. Morton would compile his notes and writings about the New World into a 1637 work, The New English Canaan. The book would be suppressed in England as seditious. It would be outright banned in Massachusetts because of the author's attacks on Puritanism and his advocacy for Native Americans. But with help from friends in high places, Morton ultimately won his legal battle against his old enemies. The Puritan-run Massachusetts Bay Company lost their charter, and their governor was removed by royal decree. Morton's friend and former employer, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, was appointed by King Charles I to be governor of all New England. Now Morton was prepared to return to Merrymount, at the new governor's right hand, ready to start the party all over again. But the English Civil War was just around the corner. With the outbreak of hostilities between royalists and parliamentarians in August 1642, American colonization was placed on hold. Desperately fighting to save the monarchy, Sir Ferdinando Gorges would never make it to the New World. But none of this would stop Thomas Morton, who was now in his early 60s. In late 1642, he returned for a third time to Massachusetts. Officially, he had no business in the New World, but secretly, he was trying to recruit unhappy Bostonians to move to Royalist settlements in Maine. By 1644, Morton was in jail, again, accused of being a Royalist agitator and of attacking the Puritan religion. The charges against him were flimsy, but his name was now infamous up and down New England. He would languish behind bars for a year until his petition for release was granted. He was then banished from Massachusetts for the final time. Morton made his way north to Maine, where he died in obscurity in 1647. His grave has been lost to memory. Today, there is very little left of Merrymount, physically or culturally. The modern sprawl of Quincy, Massachusetts has taken over the site where Englishmen and Native Americans once raised a maypole and partied as equals. A simple suburban park and a humble stone now memorialize a once raucous settlement. The seal of the city of Quincy features the hill where Thomas Morton threw New England's first rager. And that's about it. Because Merrymount lived fast and died young, there are still many unanswered questions. Was Merrymount a tolerant community of sharing and racial harmony? Or was it a glorified trading post that turned into a 17th century version of Burning Man? Was Thomas Morton a visionary who wanted to build a new world? Or did he just want to get loaded and have a good time? Was there any practical future to Merrymount's lived philosophy? Or would the colony have ultimately collapsed and been consumed by its neighbors? We know the Pilgrims had a dream, a powerful dream that became the stuff of American legend. But what was the dream of Merrymount? Was it adventure, new opportunity, economic success, or spiritual freedom? Or was it simply to throw the greatest party New England ever saw?